Madrid. The year is 1834. The palace stands silent beneath a sky, the color of old ash. Inside, the candles have burned too low, their smoke curling like the ghosts of prayers unanswered. King Ferdinand, the VII of Spain, lies dead. But in that silence, something still stirs, not peace, not grief, but the echo of a curse that has haunted his bloodline for centuries. They say every dynasty carries its own poison. For the Bourbons, it was not betrayal or war. It was the blood itself, thick with centuries of cousine marriages, poisoned by pride, disguised as purity. From that blood came Ferdinand, a man born with the body of a monarch and the anatomy of a nightmare. His birth was hailed as divine. His life would prove anything, but he grew up behind marble walls where mirrors were covered and laughter was forbidden. Servants whispered of a deformity so grotesque it defied the imagination, not of the face, nor of the mind, but of that most secret place. The part of him that should have symbolized life and power, now twisted into a symbol of shame. It was said that even the doctors looked away in horror, that the boy would fly into rages if anyone dared to glance too long, that he learned early to turn humiliation into cruelty. By the time he became king, Ferdinand had learned the only lesson his broken lineage could teach: if you cannot rule your body, rule everything else. His throne became an instrument of fear. His marriages, 4 in total, were not love stories, but rituals of despair. Each queen entered the palace with flowers and left it in silence, pale and trembling, or worse, carried out in a coffin lined with satin and rumour. The first, young Maria Antonia of Naples, barely 20, believed she was marrying a prince. On her wedding night, she met something that should never have belonged to a man. They say her screams carried through the marble corridors. The royal physicians came with oils, cushions, and narcotics, turning the royal bed into a laboratory of agony. Within 3 years, she was gone, her body destroyed, her mind broken. The second, Maria Isabel of Portugal, followed the same path: hope, horror, and death. The third, Maria Josepha of Saxony, thought science could conquer fate. She documented their encounters like a researcher, observing an experiment. But no experiment can save a soul crushed under the weight of obsession. Her pregnancy ended in blood, of her life in fever. And yet Ferdinand continued, searching not for love, not even for an heir, but for validation, a desperate attempt to prove that his deformity did not define him. When his 4th wife, Maria Cristina, arrived in Madrid already with child, he did not care. The court whispered. The ambassadors watched. The kingdom trembled, but Ferdinand accepted the unborn as his own. To deny it would have meant admitting the truth he feared most, that the curse had conquered him completely. The girl born from that deceit, Isabella, became both his salvation and his torment. He called her daughter, but in secret he compared her face to portraits of every man his queen had ever known. He turned love into surveillance, fatherhood into paranoia. The palace became a maze of hidden doors and spy holes. Even in her prayers, the queen felt his breath behind the wall. Outside, Spain was collapsing. Revolutions, starvation, rebellion. Inside, the king obsessed over shadows. He summoned alchemists, astrologers, and exorcists, hoping someone could free him from the body he hated. But the true horror was not in his deformity, it was in the way it devoured his soul. He ruled through fear, because he lived in fear. He inflicted pain, because it was the only language he understood. By the end, Ferdinand was no longer a man, but a collection of compulsions. His meals were tested for poison. His servants changed daily. his doctors interrogated for imaginary conspiracies. Even his wife's prayers were timed and recorded. When he finally stopped breathing, the palace exhaled for the first time in decades. But peace did not follow, for in that final moment, his physicians, trembling, loyal, terrified, were ordered to perform one last act. They were to preserve what had defined and destroyed him, the monstrous member that had dictated his life and shaped his madness. Sealed in wax, locked away in a vault beneath the Vatican, it remains the most grotesque relic of royal history, a relic not of lust, but of torment. Some say the curse ended with his death. Others whisper that it only changed form, that every generation still carries its shadow. Not in blood, but in pride, in denial, in the hunger for control. And so begins the tale of Ferdinand VII, the most deformed king in history, whose body was a prison, whose love was a wound, and whose crown was a mirror, reflecting every twisted secret of his soul. The story of Ferdinand VII does not begin in the silence of his deathbed, but far earlier, in the whisper of blood moving through generations of royal veins, slow and poisonous like a forgotten curse ripening in the dark. Spain, in those distant years, believed that purity of blood was the same as purity of soul. Kings married their cousins, queens shared ancestors with their own children, and courtiers toasted to the divine logic that had kept their bloodline so perfectly circular. But perfection is an illusion that demands a price, and in the marble halls of Madrid, that price was already being paid. Long before Ferdinand opened his first trembling eyes, his ancestors had begun to decay from the inside. Charles IV and Maria Louisa of Parma, his parents, were not just partners, but first cousins. Their union, as inevitable as it was, disastrous. They carried within them the echo of centuries of Habsburg inbreeding. Each marriage another tightening of the same genetic knot. What came from that knot was a child destined to embody both the glory and the sickness of Spain. A boy whose flesh itself was a battlefield between divine right and biological consequence. He was born on an autumn morning in the palace of El Escorial, when the wind smelled of iron and wet stone. The nurses spoke in hushed tones of his size, the strange proportions of his limbs, the peculiar stillness of his infant stare. He did not cry like other children. His eyes seemed too knowing, too watchful, as if he had inherited not just the title of prince, but the weary memory of every ancestor who had suffered before him. They swaddled him in silk, embroidered with holy symbols, but no amount of lace could hide what nature had carved into him. As he grew, his deformity began to reveal itself in ways the court could not ignore. At first, the physicians described it as unusual development, a phrase meant to soften what their eyes could barely comprehend. By adolescence, their language failed them entirely. One doctor's notes, found centuries later in a locked archive, described a member of such abnormal configuration that the act of union may be considered impossible without injury. The words were clinical, but between the lines bled the horror of men sworn to discretion. Servants learned quickly never to speak of it, and those who forgot were removed quietly. Their families relocated or erased from record. Behind closed doors, the young prince felt the weight of every whisper. Children of nobility were trained to hide emotion, to wear grace like armor. But Ferdinand's shame was heavier than any crown he would ever wear. When he caught his reflection in the gilded mirrors of the palace baths, he would smash them with trembling hands until shards glittered like frost on the marble floor. His father, Charles, preferred to hunt boar in the countryside rather than face his son's condition. His mother, Maria Louisa, found comfort in the arms of her lover, Manuel de Godoy, a man whose influence over the royal court was both political and deeply personal. The boy watched them, learned from them that betrayal was the natural language of intimacy. That affection always carried a hidden blade. In that atmosphere of deceit and spectacle, Ferdinand's cruelty began to grow like a second deformity. He discovered early that power could make silence obey him. When a young page accidentally entered his chamber while he was bathing, the boy was flogged until he lost consciousness. His family exiled from Madrid before dawn. To the courtiers, it was a warning. To Ferdinand, it was control. The only control his body had ever given him. The priests spoke of virtue and divine order, but Ferdinand saw in their sermons the same hypocrisy that surrounded him at home. He prayed not for mercy, but for transformation. He begged God to fix what he had broken, to make him a man like others, to let him be loved without pity or disgust. But the heavens stayed silent. Each unanswered prayer hardened his heart until faith itself became another wound. When the time came to arrange his marriage, the royal physicians were summoned to the council chamber not to celebrate, but to strategize. The problem could not be hidden forever. Spain needed an heir, and heirs required consummation. Dr. Francisco Flores, the boldest among them, proposed a plan: discreet modifications, medical instruments, specially constructed cushions to reduce injury. The king approved. The queen wept, and the documents were sealed with wax. Maria Antonia of Naples was chosen as the bride, a delicate girl with wide blue eyes and a voice that trembled when she sang. She was told of her husband's sensitivities, of his fragile health, but not of the truth. The night of their wedding, when the silk curtains closed and the torches burned low, the illusion ended. What she saw in that dim light was not a man but a legend of flesh and pain, a grotesque monument to royal blood gone wrong. Her screams shattered the stillness, echoing through marble corridors until even the guards outside turned pale. Ferdinand felt the scream like a blade. It was not just rejection, it was exposure. He believed she had seen his soul, and he hated her for it. From that night, the royal bed became a theatre of medical rituals. Oils, salves, cushions, and narcotics replaced tenderness. The act of love turned into an operation performed in silence, her body trembling beneath layers of linen, his face rigid with concentration and shame. The physicians observed, advised, and retreated, leaving behind the scent of incense and laudanum. The queen's attendants whispered that she no longer prayed, but stared at the wall for hours, her lips moving in soundless pleas. Months passed, then years. No child came. The king's frustration became paranoia. He convinced himself that his wife's fear was a rebellion of the womb, that she rejected his seed through sheer will. He turned to alchemists, astrologers, even mystics, who claimed his deformity was not a curse, but a sign of divine strength. They told him he was chosen, that his difference was power disguised as punishment. He believed them because the alternative that he was broken was unbearable. And so the rituals grew darker. Candles burned black with soot. Chants filled the night. And the queen endured them all with a body that no longer belonged to her. When she finally conceived, the court erupted in celebration. Banners unfurled. Bells rang and then silence again. When the child was lost before its first cry, the second pregnancy ended in blood and fever. The queen died whispering prayers for forgiveness to a god who had long stopped listening. Ferdinand did not weep. He ordered an investigation, accused her of sabotage, claimed she had poisoned herself to shame him. The apothecary who had treated her was found dead days later. His notes vanished. Within weeks, Ferdinand was negotiating his next marriage, as if grief were an inconvenience to be replaced. The cycle repeated. New bride, new rituals, new screams, swallowed by stone walls. Each queen lasted less than 3 years, each leaving behind a deeper silence than the last. With every funeral, Ferdinand's paranoia deepened. He began to fear his own physicians, suspecting them of conspiracy, replacing them with younger men, too terrified to contradict him. The palace became a mausoleum of mirrors, every reflection a reminder of the deformity that ruled his life. Outside the palace, Spain itself was unraveling. Revolution simmered. Colonies rebelled. Famine spread. But Ferdinand remained in his private war against his own body, blind to the crumbling empire beyond his walls. His courtiers learned that to serve him was to participate in his delusion. They nodded when he claimed the stars dictated his fertility, applauded when he summoned exorcists to bless the royal bed, pretended not to see the terror in the Queen's eyes. And so the King of Spain became less a ruler and more a prisoner of his flesh. Every breath he took was measured against his shame. Every act of cruelty, a desperate attempt to prove that he still held power over something, even if that something was pain. They called him El Deseado, the desired one, though desire had long since turned to dread. In the corridors of Madrid, the servants moved like ghosts, and the air itself seemed to carry his sickness. Even the marble floors, polished and perfect, seemed to hum with unease, as if the stones remembered every scream they had absorbed and every secret they were forced to keep. By the time the world outside realized what Spain had become under his rule, the damage was already complete. The curse of the blood had done its work. Ferdinand, child of inbreeding and ambition, had grown into the embodiment of a nation trapped between divine pride and human decay. His deformity was not just of the body, but of the soul, a mirror in which an entire empire could see its reflection and shudder, and thus the blood that whispered through generations finally found its voice in him. In the silence of his queens, in the crumbling of his kingdom, it was a voice that spoke of power without mercy, lineage without love, and a crown that had become a cage. By the time the bells of Madrid rang for his first wedding, Ferdinand VII was already a man hollowed by shame. The city rejoiced. Musicians filled the plazas, and priests spoke of divine blessings upon the royal union. Yet inside the palace, behind curtains embroidered with gold thread, the air was thick with something else, fear disguised as ceremony. The bride, Maria Antonia of Naples, was barely more than a girl. She had been raised among marble statues and gentle tutors, taught to curtsy, to smile, to believe that marriage was both duty and destiny. She arrived in Spain radiant with youth, unaware that the kingdom she was entering was not a realm of splendor, but a cage built of superstition, sickness, and silence. The courtiers described her as light itself, delicate, gracious, untouched by the heaviness that hung over the Bourbon line. But even light can tremble before darkness, too vast to comprehend. When the doors closed upon her wedding night, the world she knew ceased to exist. Her attendants waited outside for hours until the first sound reached them. Not laughter, not love, but a scream that seemed to tear through centuries of royal pride. They froze, unable to move, until another cry followed. Softer, strangled, like someone pleading with God to turn back time. When at last the doors opened, the king's physician emerged, pale as wax, his gloves stained with oils, and something darker. He spoke no word. The queen was carried out unconscious, her face white, her lips trembling as if still praying. From that night onward, the royal bedchamber became a place of ritual rather than union. The physicians returned each evening with their instruments. The servants replaced the linens, and Maria Antonia learned to surrender to procedure rather than passion. Laudanum became her only companion. The palace corridors grew used to her silence, Only the occasional sob escaped through the heavy doors. When she conceived, hope flickered for a moment across the kingdom. But hope in that palace was a fragile thing. 4 months later, she lost the child. Another year passed. Another attempt. Another grave failure. The second miscarriage nearly killed her. And by the time she was 21, the once bright Princess of Naples had become a ghost in satin gowns. Ferdinand watched her fading with a mixture of suspicion and resentment. In his mind, her weakness was rebellion. He believed she was defying him, not out of pain but malice. He accused her of witchcraft, to taking herbs to prevent pregnancy, of conspiring with her mother against Spain. When she died, officially of fever, the king refused to wear mourning black. He ordered an investigation instead, interrogated her ladies-in-waiting, and dismissed half the palace staff. The apothecary who had supplied her medicine was found lifeless 3 days later in a garden well, and his death was declared a suicide, though no one dared ask how a man who could not swim had drowned in 2 feet of water. The funeral was brief, cold, and quiet. The people of Madrid wept for their lost queen, but Ferdinand did not. His face remained expressionless as her coffin descended beneath the marble floor of the royal chapel. When the ceremony ended, he turned to his advisors and asked only one question: who next? Months later, a new procession entered Madrid. The banners were repainted. The bells rung once more. Maria Isabel of Portugal, 19 years old, arrived with a trembling smile and a heart full of naive hope. Her family had warned her in whispers of delicate matters, but how could words prepare her for the truth that waited behind those palace doors? The wedding was magnificent. The orchestra played until dawn, and the streets overflowed with roses. Yet when the festivities ended, when the lights dimmed and the crowds dispersed, the same silence returned to the same walls, and the curse began again. That night, the guards posted outside the royal suite heard the familiar sound, the thud of broken furniture, the muffled cries, and the silence that followed. When dawn came, the queen was found trembling in her bed, her body covered with bruises that physicians explained away as fainting fits. For weeks, she refused to speak. When she finally did, her voice was fragile, distant, as if it belonged to someone else. The servants said she would startle at footsteps, that she flinched when the king's shadow crossed her door. She began to waste away, eating little, sleeping less, her eyes hollowed by sleepless terror. But Ferdinand saw only betrayal. In his mind, fear was defiance. Trembling was mockery. He began to believe that Maria Isabel was plotting against him, exchanging secret letters with foreign courts, mocking his body in her prayers. He ordered her meals to be tasted 3 times before she could eat, had her attendants replaced every month, forbade her from writing home. The palace became a theatre of suspicion. The queen's room was searched nightly, her jewellery boxes opened and catalogued, her rosary examined for hidden messages. And yet, even in this madness, Ferdinand's obsession with his body never left him. He summoned physicians from across Europe, anatomists, surgeons, even carnival performers known for unusual anatomies. They gathered around him like spectators before a spectacle, measuring, sketching, suggesting absurd contraptions that might make intimacy bearable. One French doctor called it a monstrous instrument of suffering, both for its owner and for those who loved him. But love had long fled that palace. What remained was endurance, endurance of pain, endurance of humiliation, endurance of a destiny no one dared refuse. Maria Isabel's health declined rapidly. She began to speak of shadows following her, of voices whispering behind the curtains. Some said she was haunted by the spirit of the first queen. Others said she was simply losing her mind. Whether it was ghost or grief, it consumed her completely. She stopped attending Mass, stopped speaking altogether. In the spring of 1818, the court announced she had died from nervous exhaustion. In truth, her heart had given up before her body did. The king's reaction was as cold as before. He ordered multiple autopsies. Insisting that she had been poisoned, he accused her confessor of treason, her servants of conspiracy, even demanded the exhumation of Maria Antonia's coffin for comparison. He was convinced the two women were part of the same plot, a plot against his throne, against his bloodline, against himself. Each death left him more isolated, more desperate to prove he was not cursed. Yet the more he tried to control his world, the more it slipped through his fingers. The ministers feared him, the doctors avoided his gaze, and the people began to whisper the name that would follow him forever, El Deformado, the deformed one. Still, Ferdinand refused to surrender to truth. He ordered a death mask made of Maria Isabel's face and placed it beside that of Maria Antonia in a private chamber sealed with velvet drapes. Some nights, the servants swore they heard him speaking to them, two lifeless masks that now formed his only audience. The palace walls, already heavy with silence, began to echo faintly with his muttering voice, the words indistinct but soaked in despair. Outside, storms gathered over Spain, political unrest, famina, rebellion. Yet the king saw none of it. His kingdom was reduced to four walls, and the ghosts that lingered within them. He spent his nights pacing between portraits of his dead queens, touching their frames as though expecting warmth, whispering promises to bodies long turned to dust. Sometimes he laughed quietly to himself, as if telling a private joke to an invisible friend. Sometimes he wept without tears, the sound of it so low it could be mistaken for wind. By then, even his most loyal servants began to avoid the royal quarters. They said the air inside had grown strange, heavy with the smell of laudanum and decay. The candlelight seemed dimmer, the corridors colder, as though the palace itself had grown weary of housing so much grief. Those who entered rarely stayed long. They spoke of hearing faint whispers when no one else was near, of footsteps following them down, empty halls. Some swore that, in the deepest hours of the night, they saw the shadow of a woman standing at the end of the corridor, her gown trailing across the marble like mist, one of the queens. Perhaps, or simply the memory of all of them. And in the midst of it all, Ferdinand continued to breathe, to eat, to rule, though what he ruled now was little more than a tomb made of gold and silence. He had outlived 2 wives, 2 children unborn, and perhaps, in some twisted corner of his mind, he believed that was victory. But history has a cruel memory. What Ferdinand called endurance, the world would later name obsession. What he called divine justice, others saw as madness. And though his crown still shone beneath candlelight, its weight had already begun to crush him. In that stillness between the echoes of the past and the fever of what was yet to come, the king waited. For another bride, for another chance, for another illusion to replace the truth he could not face. When the courtiers whispered that Ferdinand would marry again, they did so with the same exhausted disbelief as mourners watching a ghost walk back into its own tomb. Spain had begun to tire of mourning queens. Each funeral seemed to drain a little more light from the palace, until even the gilded walls dulled into a weary shade of grey. Yet a king without an heir was a threat to the throne. And so the marriage negotiations resumed quiet, desperate, and tinged with dread. The royal houses of Europe hesitated. Princesses pretended to fall ill. Families found excuses. Only one lineage accepted the proposal, not from pride, But from poverty, the House of Saxony, debt-ridden and fading, offered their daughter Maria Josepha Amalia, a woman of 24 with calm eyes, and the composure of one who had long ago learned to bear the weight of other people's expectations. She arrived in Madrid on a cold winter morning, her carriage rolling through streets lined with watchful faces. The people cheered half-heartedly, their voices echoing off the stone like hollow prayers. Maria Josepha smiled softly through the carriage window, unaware that the city's enthusiasm was not for her, but for the brief illusion of renewal she represented. Within the palace walls, whispers slithered between tapestries, words like experiment, replacement, en cure. The courtiers spoke of her intellect, her devotion, her poise, but what they truly meant was that she was brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to step into a chamber where 2 other queens had perished. From the very first night, Maria Josepha understood that this marriage would not be of heart but of body and ritual. She approached it not with passion, but with the quiet discipline of a scientist observing a phenomenon. Her physician accompanied her from Saxony, a thin, nervous man with trembling hands who carried notebooks instead of rosaries. Together, they recorded everything: the dates, the methods, the intervals between the king's fevers and the queen's fainting spells. Ferdinand, accustomed to fear, did not know what to make of this serenity. Her lack of horror unsettled him. Her composure felt like judgment. He had expected another trembling wife, another victim whose terror could be mistaken for worship. Instead, he found a woman who met his gaze with a calm that felt almost divine. When he spoke of omens and bloodlines, she listened. When he raged, she observed. Her silence was not submission but something far colder: detachment. And that, more than any insult, began to unnerve him. In the early months, the rituals resumed as before: the oils, the cushions, the whispered prayers to saints who had long abandoned the palace. But this time, every act was documented. Maria Josepha noted the temperature of the room, the condition of the candles, even the texture of the silks beneath her hands. Each entry was written in precise, clinical script. It was said that she never cried, never screamed, only exhaled, slowly as if measuring her breath against eternity. To the king, this indifference became a mirror too cruel to bear. He began to suspect that she was not merely recording their encounters but reporting them to Saxony, to the Vatican, perhaps to God himself. The more she wrote, the more paranoid he became. He ordered her letters intercepted, her physician's notes confiscated, her servants replaced. He accused her of espionage, of plotting to expose his deformity to the courts of Europe. At night, he would wake drenched in sweat, convinced that hidden observers were watching through the walls. He tore apart the tapestries, searching for holes, demanded the palace be swept for secret passageways, and replaced his staff weekly to prevent betrayal. But no one could protect him from the real enemy, the echo of his own madness reverberating in every marble hall. Outside, Spain continued to crumble. The colonies were breaking away, the treasury empty, the people starving. But Ferdinand saw none of it. His world had shrunk to a single room, and a single fear that the woman beside him might one day tell the world the truth. Then, unexpectedly, a miracle, or perhaps another curse, Maria Josepha became pregnant. For the first time in decades, joy seemed to flicker through the palace. Bells rang, priests wept, and Ferdinand smiled a thin, cracked smile that frightened even his closest advisors. The king who had built his reign upon suspicion now believed himself chosen by heaven. He ordered daily masses, brought relics from distant cathedrals, hired guards to watch over the queen's sleep. Every plate she ate from was blessed by a bishop, Every cup she touched was inspected by alchemists. He forbade her from stepping outside, convinced that even the wind might carry poison. But miracles born from terror rarely last. By the 7th month, the Queen's body began to fail her. The doctors murmured about complications, what modern medicine would call placental abruption. But to Ferdinand it was all conspiracy. He accused the physicians of negligence, the priests of envy, even the stars of betrayal. When the pain began, he insisted on being present, his face pale beneath the trembling candlelight, as Maria Josepha screamed through hours of agony. What emerged that night was a daughter, tiny and gasping, who lived only a few hours. The king refused to let her go, cradled the small body, as if warmth alone could command life to return. Maria Josepha, bleeding and delirious, reached for him, but he did not see her. He was praying to the child, whispering promises of kingdoms and redemption to a soul already gone. She survived another 3 weeks, just long enough to watch the man she had married descend into full madness. When she died, her body cold and frail as porcelain, Ferdinand's grief was not grief at all, but accusation. He ordered the physicians to keep her body warm, to attempt resuscitation by any means. They did heating stones, burning incense, chanting prayers until the corpse began to decay before his eyes. The stench filled the palace. Servants fainted. Only when the skin turned grey and the lips stiffened did he allow her to be buried. Yet even then, he demanded that her death mask be taken, the third in his growing collection. He placed it beside the others, arranging the faces like trophies. 3 women, 3 ghosts, 3 silent witnesses to his torment. He would sit before them for hours, murmuring, asking them for forgiveness, or for secrets, or perhaps for nothing at all. The courtiers began to avoid the royal wing altogether. They said the king spoke to the masks at night, that he claimed to hear them answer. Sometimes laughter, sometimes sobs, sometimes the faintest whisper of his name. The palace guards confessed that they could no longer tell where the king's voice ended, and the echoes began. And still, Ferdinand reigned. He held audiences with ministers he no longer trusted, signed decrees he could not read, and gave orders that contradicted themselves. Spain's empire was collapsing, but within his walls, time had stopped. He wandered the corridors like a shadow wearing a crown, his slippers whispering across the marble floors where the ghosts of his queens seemed to wait in eternal procession. When night fell, he would retreat to the room of masks. There, surrounded by candlelight and silence, he spoke to his memories as if they were saints. "You left me," he would murmur to the waxen faces. "But you were mine. You were made for me." Sometimes he touched them gently, sometimes struck them in rage. Servants passing by the door heard the sound of weeping and the faint thud of something shattering. By dawn, he would emerge, composed, his voice steady, his eyes hollow. He told his attendants he had been praying. They nodded, bowed, pretended to believe, for disbelief was dangerous in the palace of a mad king. Outside the gates, Madrid grew restless. The markets emptied. The people whispered of hunger and revolt. And across the Atlantic, the colonies declared their freedom one by one. But Ferdinand, locked inside his own labyrinth of grief and paranoia, remained untouched by history. To him, there was only one story left to live: the endless attempt to conquer the body that had betrayed him, to defeat the shame that had already become his legacy. And yet, even madness requires continuity. Within a year, his ministers, fearing both his death and his despair, began to search for another bride. Spain, they reasoned, could not survive another decade without an heir. Ferdinand agreed, not because he believed in marriage, but because he still believed in the possibility of redemption. Somewhere in the depths of his unraveling mind, he imagined that the next queen would succeed where all others had failed, that her body would be strong enough to bear the weight of his curse. But as the couriers rode once more across Europe, bearing proposals sealed with wax, the palace servants whispered among themselves, not of politics or alliances, but of the room of masks and the man who prayed to the dead. They said the candles never truly went out in that room, that some nights a fourth chair appeared beside the table, as if waiting for someone new, and when the wind passed through the corridors, it sounded almost like breathing. By the time Maria Cristina of Naples arrived in Madrid, the palace had already begun to rot from within. The corridors smelled faintly of incense and sickness, and the marble floors, once polished to a royal shine, seemed dulled by years of grief and laudanum. The mirrors were veiled in black cloth. No reflection was allowed to remind the king of what he had become. Outside, Spain was cracking apart rebellion in the colonies, of hunger in the streets, whispers of revolution in the cafes. But Ferdinand, swollen with paranoia and wrapped in his silks of denial, believed that salvation would come in the shape of another queen. His ministers called it strategy. The church called it duty, but everyone else called it madness. Maria Cristina was not chosen for beauty or virtue, but for utility. She was a distant cousin, Catholic, politically convenient, and more importantly, she was already with child. The ambassadors knew it. The priests knew it. Even the servants in Naples whispered it behind fans. Yet Ferdinand accepted her anyway. For to deny her pregnancy would have been to face the unthinkable truth that he could never father a child. To his mind, this was not deceit but providence. God, in his mercy, had finally given him an heir by other means. He would raise the child as his own, and Spain would call it divine will. The wedding took place under a sky the colour of lead. Rain fell like tears upon the cathedral roof, muffling the hymns into something funereal. The king, now older and slower, walked beside his bride with a stiffness that seemed carved into his bones. The courtiers clapped. The bells rang. But beneath every cheer trembled the unspoken question: how long would this queen last within the first month? The truth of Maria Cristina's condition could no longer be hidden. Her belly swelled quickly, her cheeks flushed with the unmistakable glow of life. Ferdinand, blinded by his own delusion, declared it a miracle. He had his court chaplain announce to the people that divine grace had restored the king's strength, and that Spain would soon be blessed with a princess born of holy intervention. Priests blessed her chambers. Soldiers guarded her doors. And Ferdinand smiled, the smile of a man who had confused illusion with faith. When Isabella was born, the court erupted in joy. The bells of Madrid rang for days, and processions filled the streets with banners of gold. The king held the infant in trembling arms, his eyes shining with tears that no one dared call madness. But behind that fragile joy lurked something darker. In the privacy of his thoughts, Ferdinand saw not a child but a question. He would study her face for hours, comparing the curve of her nose, the colour of her eyes, the shape of her hands to portraits of himself, of Maria Cristina, of every man who had ever stood too close to her. He hired artists to draw composite sketches of possible fathers, laid them side by side with the baby's image, and whispered to himself that resemblance was proof. That denial was treason against his own hope. As Isabella grew, the king's obsession grew with her. He loved her fiercely, possessively, as if the intensity of his gaze could erase doubt itself. But love born from fear soon turns to control. He began to monitor Maria Cristina's every breath, Servants reported that he had peepholes installed behind the walls of her private rooms, narrow slits that allowed him to watch her unseen. The Queen, unable to protest, learned to move through her days as if under constant judgment. Every prayer she uttered, every glance she gave to her attendants, every letter she wrote was inspected, catalogued, and dissected for hidden meaning. At meals, Ferdinand demanded elaborate precautions. Each dish was prepared under supervision, tasted by several servants who were then forced to wait half an hour before the king would eat, to ensure that any poison would reveal itself through their deaths. Some collapsed from exhaustion or hunger, yet he saw only proof that danger lurked everywhere. The Queen's clothes were searched for secret messages. Her rosary beads were cracked open to ensure they contained no rolled-up notes. She could not breathe without permission. Yet Maria Cristina was neither fragile nor foolish. Beneath her calm exterior, she understood that her survival depended on performance. She learned to speak softly, to flatter him gently, to turn her captivity into something that resembled devotion. At night, when he prowled the corridors, muttering to himself, she would feign sleep and pray silently to any god who might still listen. She began writing letters to her family in Naples, letters filled with quiet despair. "I live," she wrote, "in a glass cage where every movement is observed. I am watched not only when I speak, but when I am silent." The letters were intercepted, of course, but even when they reached the king's hands, he found no rebellion in them, only sadness. And sadness, to him, was loyalty. Still, the disease of suspicion spread. Ferdinand began to see betrayal everywhere. A servant smiling too long was a conspirator. A priest bowing too low was a spy. The court transformed into a labyrinth of whispers. Ministers replaced ministers. Guards replaced guards. No one trusted anyone, and everyone feared the next accusation. Spain was suffocating under the weight of one man's terror. Outside the palace, famine gnawed at the countryside. The colonies across the ocean declared their independence one after another. And the Spanish Empire, once vast as the horizon, crumbled like old parchment. Yet Ferdinand spent his days measuring the Queen's steps, timing her prayers, counting how long she looked at the crucifix. He no longer ruled a kingdom, he ruled an illusion. The courtiers noticed changes in him. His hands shook. His speech slurred. His eyes darted constantly as if tracking invisible enemies. Sometimes he would stop mid-sentence, frozen in a trance, murmuring to shadows no one else could see. At other times, he would summon his physicians and force them to examine Maria Cristina before allowing her near him, convinced she might poison him through touch. The Queen endured these indignities with the stillness of a saint carved from marble. Her only rebellion was silence, and in that silence, something strange began to happen. Ferdinand's hatred turned to dependence. He could not trust her, yet he could not live without her presence. She was his prisoner and his keeper, his fear and his comfort. At night, he would call her name in half-conscious delirium, begging her not to leave him, even as he accused her of plotting his death. The lines between love and paranoia blurred until both became the same poison feeding his veins. Isabella, the child of doubt and hope, became his final obsession. He would stare at her for hours, sometimes weeping, sometimes laughing. He made the doctors examine her tiny hands for signs of divine blessing, ordered her crib lined with relics from saints, and forbade anyone but himself to hold her. The servants whispered that the king would sometimes wake her in the middle of the night just to study her face by candlelight, whispering prayers that sounded more like apologies. By 1832, Ferdinand's mind had nearly dissolved. He ate little, slept less, and spoke in fragmented sentences filled with names of the dead. His ministers began to govern in his stead, careful to hide every decree behind the illusion of his authority. The palace itself seemed to decay with him, curtains heavy with dust, walls damp with mildew, and the corridors echoing with the endless shuffle of guards who no longer knew whom they were guarding. When the end came, it came slowly, like a candle suffocating in its own wax. The king's body grew stiff, his skin grey, his breath shallow. He refused food, claiming it smelled of betrayal. The physicians whispered that it was gout, but the courtiers said it was madness consuming its host. In his final days, Ferdinand lay surrounded by his collection of death masks, the frozen faces of his lost queens staring down at him. He whispered to them as if they were angels or judges. To Maria Cristina, he offered neither apology nor affection, only command. "Preserve me," he said, "so they will remember." And so, when the bells of Madrid tolled again on a September morning in 1833, it was not for another wedding but for the end of an era, or perhaps for the end of a disease. The king who had tried to conquer his body, his wives, and his fate had finally been conquered by all three. Yet even death did not bring rest. The physicians, trembling and obedient, carried out his last request. They preserved what had defined and destroyed him, the grotesque symbol of his reign, the deformity that had haunted his life and defiled his soul. It was sealed in wax, locked away in silence, and hidden in the vaults of the Vatican, where no light could touch it. In time, the courtiers would speak of it only in whispers. The peasants would tell stories by candlelight of the cursed king, whose shame became Spain's doom. And somewhere, beneath marble and time, Maria Cristina would rock her daughter in the quiet of her chambers, listening to the echo of her husband's madness fade into the distance, a ghost finally swallowed by its own shadow. But even then, the curse was not gone. It lived on in memory, in bloodlines, in the quiet dread that sometimes fills the hearts of those who inherit thrones built on secrets. And perhaps, if one were to walk through the corridors of the old palace on a moonless night, one might still hear it, the faint whisper of silk, the sigh of a woman's prayer, and the shudder of a man who was king, yet never master of himself. When the final breath left the lips of Ferdinand VII, the air in the royal bedchamber seemed to pause, as though the walls themselves were unsure whether to mourn or to sigh with relief. Outside, the bells of Madrid began to toll, their echoes rolling through narrow streets where the people listened in silence, uncertain if they should grieve the passing of their king or whisper prayers of gratitude that his reign of terror had finally come to an end. Inside, beneath the shroud of incense and candle smoke, the court physicians gathered around the corpse, their faces pale and glistening in the dim light. They had been ordered to perform one last service, one that no man of medicine could have imagined without trembling. The Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, entered the room, dressed not in black, but in grey, her eyes swollen from nights without sleep, her voice steady only because it had forgotten how to tremble. She looked not at her husband's face, but at the sheet that covered his lower body, the same part of him that had defined his life and destroyed every soul that dared to love him. Then, in a voice barely louder than the hiss of a dying candle, she gave the command. "Preserve it," she said. For history, the physicians did not question her. To serve a monarch, even a dead one, was to obey without thought. They drew the curtains, sealed the doors, and began their dreadful work. Instruments clattered softly against silver trays, the rustle of linen mingling with the faint drip of wax. One man crossed himself, another whispered a prayer in Latin, But no amount of faith could sanctify what they were about to do. When the sheet was pulled back, silence fell. Even in death, the deformity was grotesque beyond reason, swollen, discolored, and marked by scars from years of failed treatments. The chief surgeon recorded its measurements in a trembling hand, 14 inches in length, irregular in form, the texture uneven, as if the flesh itself had grown weary of existing. They worked through the night, embalming, draining, sealing, wrapping the specimen in layers of linen soaked in wax and herbs, then placing it in a glass vessel filled with preserving fluid. When dawn came, the sun touched the surface of the jar and turned the liquid gold, and for a moment it looked almost holy. By mid-morning, the body of Ferdinand lay dressed in royal robes, the deformity hidden once more beneath embroidered silk. Priests chanted low requiems. Courtiers filed past with expressions of studied grief, and the Queen stood motionless at the foot of the coffin, her gloved hands clasped so tightly that the seams split. The people who came to pay their respects saw only the image of piety and power. They could not see the jar that had been taken away in silence, carried through a back corridor by two frightened men who swore never to speak of it again. Some say it was sent to the royal crypt. Others claim it travelled across the sea to the archives of the Vatican, sealed away in a vault, reserved for relics too dangerous for human eyes. But even secrets have a way of breathing. Within weeks, rumours began to seep through the cracks of Madrid's gossiping salons. They spoke of the monstrous relic, of the Queen's strange request, of the doctors who had fainted during the autopsy. Foreign ambassadors wrote letters home describing the unholy curiosity of Spain's royal physicians. One French diplomat, a man known for embellishment, claimed that he had seen the object himself, displayed briefly in a laboratory like a saint's relic, floating in a jar of honey-coloured fluid. Others dismissed the story as a grotesque allegory, yet the whispers grew louder with each retelling until they became legend. In the streets, people began to speak of Ferdinand, not as a man, but as a caution. Mothers frightened their children with tales of the cursed king whose body had betrayed God's design. Artists painted secret caricatures of him, a crown balanced upon a skull, a serpent coiled around his scepter, a shadow in the shape of a man. Priests spoke in sermons of the dangers of pride and the madness of bloodlines kept too pure. And though the Vatican never confirmed the existence of the relic, it became a ghost that haunted Europe's collective imagination. Maria Cristina, left to rule as regent for her infant daughter Isabella, carried the burden of that legacy like a stain no mourning veil could hide. She was seen often at Mass, her face pale, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched her rosary. The courtiers noticed that she rarely spoke of her late husband, yet she ordered his private chambers sealed and untouched, as though to imprison his memory within the same walls that had once held his madness. The room of death masks remained locked, the key kept close to her breast. Sometimes, when the palace was quiet and the night stretched thin, servants claimed to hear faint sounds from behind those doors, the creak of wood, the shuffle of footsteps, a whisper too low to distinguish. The doctors who had preserved the relic fared no better. Within months, one of them left Madrid without explanation, another fell into delirium, muttering about eyes, watching him in the dark. The chief surgeon, burdened by guilt, confessed to his confessor that he feared they had trapped not flesh but spirit, that what they sealed in glass had been more than a body part. It was the vessel of the king's torment, still pulsing with the hatred and fear that had driven him mad. The confessor advised him to pray, but prayer offered little comfort to a man who had looked upon such horror and survived. Meanwhile, Spain stumbled through the fragile dawn of a new era. The young princess, Isabella, grew beneath the shadow of her father's curse, her innocence guarded by walls that had known too much suffering. The nobles fought for power, the church for influence, and beyond the palace gates, the people began to murmur about liberty. The age of kings was dying, and Ferdinand's grotesque legacy had become its final symbol, a body so corrupted by control that even death could not free it from itself. Years passed, and the story changed shape with each telling. Some said the relic had been destroyed, burned by priests who feared it was a demon's vessel. Others insisted it was still preserved in a hidden vault beneath the Vatican library, labeled under false names, guarded by silence and holy dread. Travelers to Rome claimed that the archivists there refused to speak of certain sealed rooms, their faces tightening at the mention of Spain. And in those dark chambers, they said, to rested a jar where something once human still floated, its shape distorted by time, its meaning long forgotten by the living, but never erased by God. For historians, the story became an obsession. They searched for records, correspondences, anything to confirm that such a thing had existed. But the archives yielded only fragments, a line in a doctor's diary, a Vatican inventory listing anatomical specimen, provenance royal, dated 1834, and a rumour that the Pope himself had ordered it hidden to protect the dignity of kings. Scholars debated endlessly. Was it real, or merely a metaphor? A grotesque reflection of a dynasty that had devoured itself through arrogance and fear. Yet for the people who had lived under Ferdinand's reign, it was not metaphor but memory. They remembered the silence of their king, the terror of his eyes, the way he turned love into surveillance and faith into punishment. His deformity had been both physical and spiritual, a mirror of the corruption that plagued an empire pretending to be divine. And so, even after the relic vanished from sight, its story endured, whispered in taverns, painted in secret, carried across generations like an echo of a nightmare that refused to die. There were nights when travellers passing through Madrid claimed to see strange lights flickering in the windows of the old palace, long after the royal family had moved elsewhere. They said that sometimes, if one stood by the iron gates when the wind blew from the east, one could hear faint murmurs, a man's voice reciting prayers, a woman's soft weeping, and the rhythmic sound of dripping wax. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps the past, once awakened, never truly returns to sleep. Maria Cristina, in her later years, avoided that part of the palace entirely. She dedicated herself to her daughter's education, to politics, to the fragile task of preserving a throne built upon ashes. Yet she could never escape the memory of that morning, the smell of herbs and wax, the sound of glass being sealed, the image of a body preserved against nature's will. It followed her into her dreams, where she saw Ferdinand's face behind a veil of liquid, smiling that same strange smile he had worn on their wedding day. And thus the legend lived on, half truth, half curse. The story of a king who tried to command the body as he had commanded his kingdom, who believed that control was the same as salvation, and who died without understanding that both body and power rot when imprisoned too long. His relic, if it still exists, lies somewhere in silence, waiting beneath layers of dust and sanctity. Perhaps one day it will be found. Perhaps it is better that it never is. For some truths are not meant for the eyes of the living, they belong to the night, to the whispering corridors of memory, where madness sleeps but never dies. In the years that followed the death of Ferdinand VII, Spain seemed to breathe again. Though it was not the breath of life, but the long exhalation of a body released from suffering, the streets of Madrid were quieter, the sky clearer, the air less heavy, as if the earth itself had been holding its lungs for too long. Yet the silence that replaced the king's voice was not peace, it was unease. The country moved carefully, as one might walk through the ruins of a house where a crime had been committed. Everything looked the same: the palaces, the churches, the marble statues of saints. But something invisible had changed. The people spoke more softly. The bells rang less proudly. And even the light seemed to fall differently upon the stones. The shadow of the dead monarch lingered over all of it, stretching from the royal crypt to the humblest tavern. Maria Cristina, now the regent, ruled in the name of her infant daughter, Isabella. Her face was calm, her voice measured, her hands always folded upon her lap like those of a penitent saint. But behind her serenity lay exhaustion. She had survived Ferdinand. Yes, but she had not escaped him. He had carved himself into her memory, leaving behind invisible scars that no prayer could heal. Every corridor of the palace reminded her of his eyes watching through hidden peepholes, his footsteps echoing at midnight, his voice calling her name, not with love, but with ownership. Even in death, he remained the ghost that refused to let her live. The courtiers treated her with reverence, but also with pity. They spoke of her strength, yet whispered of her loneliness. They said she still heard him sometimes in the creak of a door, in the sudden chill that swept through the room. Some nights she would wake from sleep, certain that she had felt his breath against her ear. She would light a candle, whisper a prayer, and tell herself it was only memory. But memories can be crueler than ghosts. They do not vanish when the sun rises. They wait, quietly, for the next silence to bloom. Spain itself was trying to wake from a nightmare. The nobles quarrelled over power, the clergy fought to keep influence, and the people, weary of both, began to murmur the word revolution. The young queen, still a child, was carried from palace to palace like a fragile relic of hope. Her face appeared on coins and in prayers, but her crown rested on trembling hands. The same blood that had produced Ferdinand ran through her veins, the cursed inheritance of pride, fear, and divine right. And there were those who believed that the sickness of the father would one day return in the daughter. Across Europe, the story of the deformed king spread like a rumor that refused to die. In the drawing rooms of Paris and Vienna, men in powdered wigs recounted the tale of the monarch whose body mirrored his madness, whose obsession with control had destroyed both his wives and his country. Painters imagined him as a grotesque figure bathed in candlelight, surrounded by masks of his dead queens. Poets wrote verses about the curse of inbred blood, and doctors debated whether his deformity had been natural or divine punishment. The Vatican, silent as stone, neither confirmed nor denied the existence of the relic rumoured to rest within its vaults. Yet in that silence, the legend only grew. Scholars argued about his reign. Some said Ferdinand had been a victim of his birth, the tragic result of generations that mistook purity for perfection. Others called him a monster, proof that cruelty and fear could disguise themselves as authority. But no matter which version they believed, all agreed on one thing: his story was a warning. The age of absolute kingship had begun to crack, and from that crack seeped the realization that power without conscience leads not to glory, but to decay. In Madrid, the people began to tell their children stories by the firelight, not of dragons or saints, but of Ferdinand, the king who could not rule his own body, and therefore sought to rule every other. They said that on certain nights, when the wind carried the smell of the river and the bells of the old cathedral tolled after midnight, one might hear footsteps pacing inside the royal crypt, slow and deliberate, as though someone still waited for an heir who would never come. Maria Cristina, bound by politics and faith, endured her regency with quiet dignity, yet those closest to her noticed small signs of unease. She avoided mirrors and refused to sleep in the royal chambers. She ordered the removal of certain tapestries, certains portraits, claiming they reminded her of the past, though no one dared to ask which part of the past she meant. She spent long hours at her writing desk, her letters filled with phrases of sorrow, written between the lines of diplomacy. Her courtiers said that sometimes, in the middle of a meeting, her gaze would drift toward the door, as if she expected someone unseen to enter. And in those moments, the room would fall silent, because they all felt it too, the presence of something that should have been buried, but was not. The palace itself had changed. Servants whispered that doors once sealed by Ferdinand were opening by themselves, that the old mirrors beneath their black veils reflected shapes that did not belong to the living. A maid claimed to have seen a man's shadow pass across the Queen's chambers, though the King's apartments had long been locked. Another swore she heard faint weeping from behind the walls where the peepholes had once been. Most were dismissed or silenced. But their fear spread. Soon no one wanted to walk alone through the eastern wing after dusk. As the years drifted by, the story of Ferdinand became something more than history. It became myth. His name was invoked, not in reverence, but in warning. Superstitious mothers would whisper to their children, "Do not lie, or the deformed king will come for you." Scholars wrote treatises about royal insanity, citing him as the perfect example of how power can rot the mind. And yet, beneath the layers of disgust and fascination, there was also pity, a faint recognition that behind the monster had once been a child born into a world already poisoned by the sins of his ancestors. In Rome, the whispers persisted. A few travelers swore that deep beneath the Vatican library, where the air smelled of wax and forgotten centuries, there existed a locked door without a keyhole. Behind it, they said, was a room lit by a single eternal lamp, and on a marble table stood a jar covered by black cloth. The guards who kept that corridor were instructed never to speak of it, never to approach it at night. They said the light inside the room sometimes flickered on its own, though no one entered. Whether it was truth or imagination, no one could say, but the idea of that hidden relic, that preserved symbol of Spain's madness, became the stuff of both horror and holiness. As Isabella grew into womanhood, she carried her father's shadow like a mantle she could not remove. Her reign would begin in turmoil and end in exile, as though the curse had merely changed its shape. History, after all, has a cruel habit of repeating its tragedies through new faces. The same hunger for control, the same fear of vulnerability, the same illusion of divine destiny, all of it flowed through her blood as it had through his. And Spain, restless and wounded, remained caught between reverence for its past and revulsion for it. In the quiet years that followed, when revolutions burned across Europe and old empires turned to dust, the legend of Ferdinand VII faded into something like a dream, distant, almost unreal. But there were still those who remembered. Scholars, priests, and wanderers who had heard the story as children would sometimes pause when walking through old cathedrals, feeling a strange chill, as if unseen eyes were watching from the shadows. They would glance toward the altar, toward the candles, and wonder if somewhere beneath their feet lay the remnants of a man who had once ruled not through love or reason, but through fear. And sometimes, in the depth of night, when the city slept and the moon lay low over the rooftops, the wind that swept through Madrid carried with it the faintest echo, the toll of distant bells, the rustle of robes, the whisper of a voice half pleading, half commanding. No one could say if it was imagination or the persistence of something that refused to die. For history does not bury its monsters, it preserves them. The way those physicians once preserved his body sealed in memory, embalmed in shame, waiting beneath glass for the curious and the damned to look upon it again. So ended the reign of Ferdinand VII, not with the triumph of kings, but with the endurance of ghosts. His story outlived him because it was never truly his alone. It belonged to the blood that birthed him, the empire that sustained him, and the silence that followed him. And as the centuries turned, the name of the deformed king faded into whispers, then into dust. Yet his curse lingered not in the relic sealed in the Vatican, but in the hearts of those who still mistook control for power, possession for love, and pride for salvation. As the years turned into decades, the story of Ferdinand VII slipped quietly from the pages of history into the veins of legend. And from there, it bled into the collective dream of Europe. No one spoke of him in the language of politics anymore. His wars, his decrees, his treaties had long turned to dust. What survived was not the man who wore the crown, but the myth of his deformity, the strange, grotesque echo of a body that had ruled an empire and yet never belonged to itself. In every corner of the continent, whispers of the Spanish king became a metaphor, told in the flicker of candlelight the tale of the monarch who tried to imprison shame and ended up embalming his own soul. There were travelers who swore they had seen his face in forgotten portraits, tucked away in dusty archives, eyes painted too dark, lips pressed too tightly, as if the artist had captured not likeness but torment. In the salons of Paris, scholars debated whether the so-called relic preserved in the Vatican was real or allegory, a curiosity of science or the lingering punishment of divine irony. The poets, as always, took it further. They wrote of Ferdinand as the embodiment of mankind's arrogance, a creature who thought he could command flesh, will, and destiny by decree. His deformity became an emblem of Europe itself, a continent swollen with self-worship and collapsing under the weight of its own pride. In the universities, young doctors studied the medical descriptions of his condition and argued over inherited diseases. But beneath the surface of their rational discussions lay the same unease that had haunted the courtiers who once served him. The sense that what had broken in the king was not only the body, but the mirror that separates reason from madness. They called it degeneration, hereditary decay, the failure of royal bloodlines. Yet what frightened them most was the possibility that it was not royal at all, that any man, given too much power over others and too little mercy for himself, might one day become another Ferdinand, trapped inside his own reflection. Meanwhile, Spain tried to bury its ghosts beneath new wars and new kings. Isabella grew, married, gave birth to heirs, and then lost her throne, as if the crown itself carried a memory of its former master. The people who once whispered of the deformed king now spoke of revolutions, constitutions, and republics. But every time the nation fractured, every time another tyrant rose from the ashes, someone would inevitably murmur, "He has the eyes of Ferdinand." It became a phrase passed between generations, a quiet superstition, meaning not madness exactly, but the dangerous hunger for control disguised as righteousness. Far from Madrid, in libraries where light fell like dust upon parchment, a few curious souls began to seek the truth of the relic. One Jesuit scholar claimed to have found a sealed letter from a Vatican archivist, describing an object of unnatural form, preserved for moral contemplation. Another insisted that the jar was moved during the wars of Italy, hidden beneath the catacombs to keep it from falling into profane hands. Each claim contradicted the last, but that only made the story grow. The relic became less an artifact than an idea, a symbol of what humanity hides when it cannot face its own reflection. In the 20th century, when reason declared itself sovereign and science dethroned superstition, Ferdinand returned again, not as a king but as a case study. Psychoanalysts wrote of him as the archetype of the wounded ruler, a man so consumed by bodily shame that he sought to rebuild the universe in his image. They said his deformity was the body's revolt against the soul's tyranny, that his cruelty was not born of malice, but of terror. For what could be more terrifying than the realization that one's power stops at one's own skin, that the flesh, no matter how crowned, remains stubbornly mortal, grotesquely human, and yet, even as the scholars dissected him in essays and conferences, something strange persisted. Whenever his name was spoken aloud, it seemed to bring with it a faint discomfort, a hush in the room, a sense that one was trespassing into a memory too intimate, too contaminated by sorrow. For Ferdinand's tragedy was not only his own, it was the tragedy of every soul that has tried to master what cannot be mastered, the trembling mystery of being alive in a body that refuses perfection. There were painters in Madrid who returned to his image. They depicted him not as the tyrant of history books, but as a figure dissolving into shadow, half man, half echo, his body melting into wax, his crown sinking into the murky light. They said they dreamed of him before they painted, that he appeared to them in the flicker of the oil lamp, not as a ghost demanding remembrance, but as a confession of the human condition itself, that inside every grandeur lies deformity, inside every beauty, decay. In the cathedrals of Spain, old priests still whispered his name, only in confession. They spoke of his soul wandering between the chapels, kneeling before altars, begging for the forgiveness of wives whose faces were now only masks of wax and dust. Pilgrims passing through claimed to hear soft knocks echoing through the crypt at night, like someone gently tapping from within a sealed tomb. The air in those halls felt colder, as if the stones themselves remembered the weight of a man who had tried to command God's silence and failed. Beyond Spain, his legend drifted into literature. Writers in London and Vienna turned him into allegory, a warning draped in velvet. In their plays, Ferdinand was not merely a king but an eternal symbol of obsession, the ruler who cannot sleep, the husband who cannot love, the believer who cannot be forgiven. They changed his name. They moved him through centuries. Yet the essence remained, the deformity that begins in the flesh and ends in the soul. By then, the relic had become more myth than matter. Some said it had dissolved, that time and air had claimed it as all things are claimed. Others swore it still existed, pulsing faintly in its glass, prison like the preserved heart of a saint turned monstrous. A Vatican librarian, interviewed late in his life, once said that the strangest thing about the archives was not what was kept there, but what was hidden so carefully that even its existence was forbidden to name. When asked what he meant, he only smiled and whispered, "There are relics that do not bless, they remember." In the quiet corridors of memory, Ferdinand remained. He no longer belonged to history. He belonged to every whisper about the corruption of power, every cautionary tale told to those who confuse fear with authority. When people spoke of him now, they spoke not of Spain or monarchy, but of the endless war between the body and the will. His deformity was no longer scandal, it was mirror. And through it, humanity saw its reflection, trembling but unmistakable, the same arrogance, the same longing, the same desperate hunger to control what was never ours. And perhaps that is why the legend endures, not because of the grotesque details that once fascinated the curious, but because within that horror lay a secret so universal that it could not die. Ferdinand's story was never only about the flesh. It was about the way shame can turn love into cruelty, the way fear can twist power into madness, the way a man can mistake the silence of others for obedience when it is only horror. His empire fell, his body turned to dust, his relic perhaps to vapor, but the sickness he embodied still walks among us, whenever control replaces compassion, whenever pride refuses to kneel before humility, whenever the need to dominate is mistaken for the will to survive. So the centuries passed, and still the ghost of the deformed king lingered in the bloodstream of history. The candles burned down. The palaces changed hands. The thrones turned to museums. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the air is thin and even the clocks hesitate between seconds, there remains the faintest sound, a heartbeat, not of life but of memory, steady and unrepentant. It is the rhythm of history itself, repeating what it never learns, carrying forward the story of a man who tried to master the world by conquering his own shame. And somewhere, perhaps beneath the stones of Rome or Madrid, perhaps nowhere at all, there lies a jar wrapped in darkness, the liquid inside still gold under invisible light. Within it, the last echo of Ferdinand VII waits not for judgment, not for redemption, but for remembrance. The relic is not merely flesh. It is a question. Eternal and unanswered, can power ever make peace with the human heart that beats beneath it? There comes a moment in every story when words begin to fade, when what was once history dissolves into something quieter, like breath after prayer, like the slow turning of dust in a sunbeam. So it is with the tale of Ferdinand VII, the king whose name once made courtiers tremble and whose shadow fell across the marble floors of Spain like a stain no wind could erase. Time, merciful and cruel, has buried his footsteps beneath centuries of silence. Yet in that silence, something still stirs, faint and persistent, like the whisper of a dream refusing to end. In the old palace, the walls remain. The tapestries have faded, the portraits have cracked, and the gilded frames no longer shine. Yet the air remembers. If you stand alone in the royal corridor at dusk, when the last light bleeds through the tall windows and the dust floats like pale ash, you can almost hear it, the echo of heavy doors closing, the soft rustle of robes, the heartbeat of a kingdom that mistook fear for faith. The marble under your feet once trembled with the march of soldiers, the sobs of queens, the pacing of a king who could never find rest within his own skin. The stones do not forget. They hold the stories we try to bury. Ferdinand's body was sealed in the royal crypt, his crown laid upon his chest, his name carved into cold granite. Yet what was buried there was only the shell of him, the empty armor of a man who had long since ceased to exist. The true Ferdinand, the one made of shame, obsession, and sorrow had already escaped the coffin. He lived on in the stories of servants, in the dreams of priests, in the trembling of those who heard his name at night. Some said they saw him wandering the palace gardens long after his death, his robes trailing through the fog, his head bowed, not in repentance but in endless searching, as though he were still trying to find the piece of himself that had been locked away. Maria Cristina lived out her days, surrounded by politics and ghosts. The courtiers called her wise, but she never smiled without sadness. Sometimes, she would visit the crypt in secret, lighting a single candle near his tomb, not out of love, but out of habit, the same habit of survival that had once kept her alive beside him. She would stand there for a long time, watching the flame waver, and in that flicker she saw the reflection of a past she could neither forgive nor forget. The candle always burned too quickly, as if even fire wanted to escape that memory. When she left, she never looked back. Spain moved on, as nations do. Wars came and went. Revolutions rose and fell, and the world outside the old palace began to spin faster, leaving behind the echoes of kings. But the legend of the deformed king never truly vanished. It became something quieter, subtler, a parable told to remind the living of what power can do when joined with pain. To some, he was a monster. To others, a tragedy. To the poets who came later, He was both a man who carried within his body the reflection of an entire era's sickness, a mirror of divine ambition twisted by human weakness. The relic, if it still exists, lies somewhere beyond reach of daylight. Some say it sleeps beneath the vaults of the Vatican, in a jar that glows faintly under candlelight, the golden liquid unmoved by time. The priests who guard it are said to walk softly in that corridor, for the air there is heavy, and silence hangs like a warning. Others claim it was destroyed, burned by hands, too terrified to let it remain. The glass cracking as if exhaling centuries of secrecy. But no matter what truth one believes, the relic endures not as flesh, but as metaphor, for every man carries within him his own relic, something preserved by fear and shame, something he hides even from God. Ferdinand's curse was only that his was made visible. In the deeper language of myth, his story became a mirror for all empires. Each time a ruler tried to control the hearts of men, each time a nation built its faith on domination rather than compassion, the shadow of Ferdinand returned, whispering from beneath the crown, "You cannot rule what you despise." And so his name lived on, not in marble, not in him, but in the quiet recognition that the greatest deformity is the soul's hunger for control over what it cannot understand. Génération passed. The palace changed owners. Its rooms turned into museums. Tourists wandered through the gilded halls, their footsteps echoing where queens once wept. In one forgotten chamber, beneath a cracked fresco of angels, stood an empty glass case, its plaque erased by time. Guides spoke of missing artifacts, of relics moved during wars, of mysteries no archivist could explain. And sometimes, when the last visitor left and the doors were locked for the night, the security guards swore they heard faint tapping from inside the case, like the beating of a heart, long stilled but never surrendered. Perhaps it is only imagination. Perhaps it is history's way of keeping itself awake. For even the dead, if remembered too vividly, to begin to dream again through those who speak their names. And Ferdinand's name, strange, heavy, sorrowful, still carries the echo of the life that shaped it. He is every man who tried to master his reflection, every ruler who mistook fear for loyalty, every soul who built a kingdom inside his own wounds. His story is not about a king's deformity, but about the deformity of power itself, how it begins as protection and ends as a cage, how it consumes those who wield it until all that remains is silence. And so the tale drifts on, through books and whispers, through paintings and prayers, through the restless memory of those who still seek meaning in what should have been forgotten. The bells of Madrid still ring on cold mornings, and sometimes, when the fog lies thick over the river, their sound seems to carry an extra tone low, mournful, like a voice calling from beneath the water. It is the voice of a man who wanted to be remembered. And indeed he is, though not in the way he hoped. History, in its quiet cruelty, has granted Ferdinand the immortality he desired. His face has faded, his empire crumbled, but his curse remains eternal, to be remembered, not for his crown, but for the weight it placed upon his soul. In the end, he became what all tyrants become, a story told softly at night, half warning, half lullaby, and as the centuries close over him like waves, he sinks back into the dark sea of time, not damned, not forgiven, merely remembered. The last thing that remains is the echo of the physician's hand sealing the jar, the whisper of a queen's prayer fading into dawn, and the slow, patient turning of the world that forgets nothing. If you listen closely, in that thin space between waking and sleep, you might still hear it, the faint breath of a dying king, the sigh of an empire learning to dream again. and the murmur of history itself, saying that no power, no beauty, no perfection endures. Only the story does. And thus ends the reign of Ferdinand VII, not in thunder or triumph, but in stillness, a man undone by the body he could not bear, by the power he could not control, by the love he could not give. Somewhere, beneath the dust of forgotten cathedrals, he sleeps, not alone, but surrounded by the echoes of all who have ever believed they were above their own humanity. Sleep. Then, O King of deformity and sorrow, the world has moved on, but your shadow still flickers at the edge of our dreams. For every crown cast in gold still carries a trace of your madness. And every man who seeks to rule the hearts of others will, in time, find himself standing where you once stood, in the hollow silence between pride and mercy, listening to the faint, eternal echo of his own fall.